Okay, good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming to our continuing series of events here at the Pedas Center, Pedas Communication Center, Teal College, about communication skills, media literacy, and related topics. We've been having 2 events every month all year, and tonight we're very pleased to have yet another event in our series. Tonight, Ross Nugent, a professor of film and television here at Teal, will talk about sound and vision in cinema, from live musical accompaniment during cinema's silent era to digital surround sound technology that's now enjoyed in both theater and at home. Sound has always been an integral component of the film experience. Tonight, Ross Nugent will present a lecture exploring the history of filmmaking as the development of a truly audio-visual language and the ways in which sound design affects creative decisions in cinematography and editing. The presentation includes clips from films highlighting the evolution of cinematic sound. We've got some people here in the audience and more people listening to the radio, so we're ready to go. My name is Dane Clausen. I have the privilege of working every day with Ross Nugent and being director of the Pedas Center and chair of the Department of Communication. Thanks for joining us tonight. Ross?
Thank you. Thanks a lot to Dr. Clausen for not only asking me to present tonight, but also hosting this series this entire academic year. And we'll hear a little more about some of the other events we have coming up before the end of the semester. So my interest in presenting tonight about sound. When we think about film, filmmaking, in general, we're asked to think of it in visual terms, that we're solely looking at that historically, and then sort of sound catches up at some point. And that's simply not the case, and being revisited over the last 20 years or so, partially due to some degree, the stabilization of not only recording formats and archival formats for audio, but the idea that we finally reached a place where exhibition, and when I talk about exhibition now, think about pay our money, go see a film in a theater, it's a space that's dedicated primarily to film exhibition. And we'll look a little bit at how that has stabilized over the last 15 years. So tonight we'll talk about a little bit of history, a little bit of technology, and then a little bit of theory when we think about sound. And this is a growing field of academic study in film studies. So and again, thinking about tonight's program of where these things come together, when and how, and ultimately I'm arguing that we're in a place right now where we can rely on exhibition in theater, but also presentation at home for Dolby Digital sound, surround sound, sound that recreated in a space like this here in the STAM Lecture Hall. That it's really starting to impact the way that not only how films are edited, but also how they're shot, and ultimately how they are designed when we're thinking about production design. So we'll sort of follow that lineup, and then we'll look at some clips, and more importantly, listen to some clips as we move on towards the end here. So I have a few quotes here that I wanted to cite. The first from editor, sound designer. We'll hear a little more from him and about him later on. Walter Murch is his name, Walter Murch. And he has some really fantastic ideas about cinematic sound. So he says, the mental effort of fusing image and sound in a film produces a dimensionality that the mind projects back onto the image as if it had come from the image in the first place. We do not see and hear a film, we see it. And We have a slash there. Hear, see, he sort of puts those together. So we hear, see a film. So we talk about that relationship. We'll also hear a little bit about, when we're thinking about theory, from French film scholar Michel Chion. And he poses this question, set of questions. What do I see of what I hear? What do I hear of what I see? So those are some of the things that we'll keep in mind as we look at some examples and listen in a little bit here. So I term here silent cinema, and I place them in quotation marks here. So the idea is that cinema was never really silent, right? It was, which means to say what was being recorded was not recorded without sound existing in the space, right? There are other terms that have been used. Chion actually uses this term as deaf cinema, right? Or the inability to hear, but the sound is present, right? So we'll sort of keep that in mind when we're looking at the silent cinema here. So we have audio recording. I won't talk too much about audio on its own here, but just a little bit of background. Audio recording, of course, is developed a little before what we consider contemporary cinema. So I've listed here 1879, Alexander Graham Bell, two-channel recording. You can probably guess what types of recordings he was making or what those channels might be. Kara? Two telephones, right? So the idea is that we've got sources, right? Two separate sources being recorded. This predates, of course, early cinema. We see proto-cinema into 1880s. Proto-cinema is not really established. There are proto-cinematic toys and attempts at trying to find a way to record onto a film strip. We have Thomas Edison, who is actually trying to create and had submitted a patent for a way of linking a record player in a film projector, essentially. So from the beginning, sound, since we already have the technology to record and play back sound, is leading. Sound is leading. What happens is George Eastman essentially gets the patent for flexible film strip in 1889, 35 millimeter film, which is still a standard recording format. The way that film is presented at that time, term here is sort of an early cinema, and then as a point of reference, 1895 is really what's recognized as the first time that people are in a space such as this, coming together collectively for a projected film image. This is credited to the Lumiere brothers, working outside of Paris, but simultaneously in a few different places, Germany, New Jersey, around the world, a similar technology is taking hold. So we see the birth of contemporary cinema. The early cinema approach to early cinema really is a peep show, and that's often the content. It's a single user, right? Drop your nickel in, step right up, watch the peep show, literally leaning over and watching a closed loop of film. So you're off in a corner, it's an amusement, not something that you're sitting down as an audience and taking in. The kinetoscope that I was referencing was developed by Edison, who had very little interest in developing technology that he could only sell one of those, one projector, and have any number of people come in. He wanted to actually sell the kinetoscopes, right? He wanted to sell the units, which were basically, the size of a washing machine, wooden encased film strip, very crude, right? Bulb, glass lens, peeping. So when we get up to the first contemporary screening, this is really an opportunity for sound to be presented in a shared space, right? So we've termed this era here of 1895 and 1905 this cinema of attractions. Film scholar Tom Gunning has coined this term, and basically he argues that films of this era weren't interested in telling a story. Film technology, recording, all that didn't become available, and people instinctively say, hey, I'd really like to recreate something that I just read here, this really great story. Really the impulse, aside from the peep shows, which were people dancing, strong men flexing, boxing. There's even an early cat film, no joke. There are cats boxing. That there's really just this impulse that's maybe a little seedy, some of it, that they're not instinctively wanting to tell epic stories that are 2.5 hours long, so on and so forth. So we sort of move from that era in what we term as the Nickelodeon era. So the early peep shows are taking place wherever, maybe sharing the bill with a vaudeville show, so there are other performing arts involved. Nickelodeon, hey, we have some real estate. Here's some places, usually storefronts, parts of other businesses, but still a place where you can expect to go and see one of those shows, whether it's we also see some development of short narrative films, single reels, right? People, they've already seen all of the films that you have available now when they're 30 seconds long. So we have this idea of like one-reelers, one reel of film, like 10 minutes. They start to get a little more complex. The figures right now that people are looking at suggest, based on available research and data, that around 1907 we start to see a peak. There are about 4,000 film venues across the country. And some estimates put it as high as 2 million viewers, right, in a day, can be contested. But surely at certain times when particular films come to town, weekends. We then get into the movie palace era. So I've termed this, and some of you have heard a little bit about this in some of the film classes. When we think about development of Hollywood as a studio system, but also as the sort of dream factory. So there's a huge investment in movie palaces. Has anyone here been to a movie palace? Massive movie theater, yeah. There are a few left. What happened to most of them that were still around in the 60s and 70s? There was a few companies that had some really great ideas about bisecting them, so sometimes when you go to the theaters that look really fantastic on the outside, and then you go and you sit in a tiny little room, that's often part of what was existing as a different theatrical space. So we also think about what's happening at the movie palaces. This is grandiose. It's appealing to upper middle class, more so than sort of working class, both the fare and the availability of some of the early models. It's like going to the opera. It's like going to the theater, right? Going to hear the orchestra. So to keep people entertained. So we start to have music that's not really presented with any direct correlation to the content of the film, but it comes from those other forms. Um, Sometimes they started out solely just playing music before the show, after the show, intermission, things like that. But really this development, not only do we have the large theaters, but we also have this investment by studios. And I'm focusing almost entirely today on American cinema. But huge investment in, as I listed here, this star-studded cast. So we have people coming from other performing arts. We have folks coming from ballet and musicians and theater. One of the things that made this possible, they weren't expected to speak, weren't expected to sing, didn't even have to speak the same language, right? I mean, think about that. So there's this huge appeal and influx of artists, actors, looking to make it big, heading to Hollywood, because they have the look, they understand how to perform, present themselves in front of an audience. Sometimes this is very comical, and we may, think about some early film. People are overacting, gesticulating in ways that one would normally do for the theater when you're projecting to the back, and not understanding that when you're in a close-up, you're going like this, you look as if you're manic. So while this experimentation is going on with, again, our idea of the silent cinema, excuse me, we have people performing, really not so much collaboration at this point, but I have some copyright information here. So 1897, Music Publishers Association, essentially lobbies for permission and implied payment, usually a small token fee. Thanks for asking to perform our music. Here you go. So we're thinking about licensing. 1897, of course, didn't cover theaters at the time, cinemas. But we do have a newly formed ASCAP that is looking to enforce that as well, and they want to be on the take, right? So it's a group that's looking to get permission, and they went to wanted to cover both nightclubs and films, right? So they went from everything sort of being wide open, ready to go, and be able to play, incorporate new music, contemporary music at the time, along with films, again, sort of dictated by the musicians, not the filmmakers, not that end, to everything having to fall expressly in the public domain. So we think there about some of the restrictions that are developing there. All right, so we've had an opportunity to play whatever music we want. It could be up to the owners of the theaters. Now restricted, having to rely on standards. Experiments in recording technology through the 1920s. We see this moment, film completed in 1926, released in 1927, The Jazz Singer. Really crude. Audiences went bonkers. Use of synchronized sound, right? There had been earlier efforts that could incorporate sound that was not in sync, right? So you could play a record through the amplification system of someone singing. There may be a group of people singing, but it wasn't in sync. This film in particular has a few moments that are in sync. They use this technology called Vitaphone. Remember a few minutes ago we talked a little bit about early on we have recorded sound on discs wanting to sync to sound. Well, here we have it. They're having to use a specific projector that's an interlocked system. So the rotation of the turntable right? The stylus is on there, picking up sound, is projecting. The same belt is driving the film projector, right? So mouths are moving, words are in sync, audience goes crazy, and we have this great line from the Los Angeles Times, the tombstone of the silent drama, when they're referring to sound technology. That's not to say that everybody went bonkers about this. I was very excited about the coming of sound. You could probably guess a few groups of people who might be upset about that. It's been recorded that around 1929, and Variety magazine essentially lists that there are about 50,000 musicians out of work. The theaters are trying to keep up with the technology, and it's not popular to have your musicians playing in the pit, in the orchestra, regardless of the style of music that they're playing. So I have a few other quotes here from, and some other things to cite from this era. We have a French filmmaker, René Clair, who says, it would not be impossible to endow the image with speech without abandoning the achievements of silent cinema. Imagine a film in which the spoken text took the place of the written text of the intertitles. Right, and that's our text, often dialogue and other descriptors between shots. Right? So we have action, and then a screen comes up with just text. So we refer to that as our intertitles. Okay, so imagine a film in which the spoken text took the place of the written text of the intertitles, remaining the servant of the image, and made its appearance only as a means of expression, a brief, neutral text to which no effort toward visual expression would be sacrificed. So there's an argument here that maybe it doesn't have to be sync sound. Maybe it can take the place of having to read text, read words, remove that from the visual language. We have also a strong growing movement in what's often referred to as the Soviet montage school, Soviet filmmakers that are politically engaged, that they have a philosophical ideals about ways that films should be made, that they are documentary, they are meant to inform the masses. We need to subvert the government through this aggressive editing style. It doesn't have to be literal. We don't want to do traditional narrative films. We want to shock the viewer. We want to empower the masses. So they think about sound coming, and they're not too pleased about that, and argue for sound to be used and edited. When I talk about montage, we can think about maybe our fast editing, or our maybe you've heard it termed as our sort of music video, MTV style editing. Right? It's never quite fast enough. They wanted to apply, and did apply, that same approach to sound, and had some limited success. And we'll talk a little bit about why that may be. So there are definitely challenges at this time with the technology. So discussing the jazz singer, I talked about there being one kind of specific piece of equipment. Not every theater owner, exhibition space is going to be able to purchase all of those. So we do have this lag time here. We talked a little bit already about the development of sort of the critiques of the visual language. Talked about the plight of our musicians. Well, hey, there's also a need for people who know how to record sound, people who want to work solely in sound technology. We need these things called sound stages, right? We weren't recording sound before. We can shoot next to the train station, no big deal. Not so much anymore, so we need much more labor. We need them to be built. We need people to be in charge of that. It's a huge department, massive department. So there, within the trade, there are other opportunities, jobs that do open up. I talked a little bit already about influx of actors, many of them not speaking English language. We have a number of Hollywood stars who have very poor English, or, think about this, have a persona. They're a particular type of actor in these films. So we have the one in particular I'll pick on, Rudolph Valentino. Very suave, macho. Simply put, his voice does not match. The way that we've seen him on the screen and imagine him just doesn't match. This is a real problem. And there are a number of sort of backstage films about this happening. There was a great film a few years ago, 2011, called The Artist, which was basically a throwback to, it was a silent film. It was a silent era film, right? There's an underscore, intertitles, no dialogue, black and white. Chronicles just that. So benefits here. All of a sudden there's an industry that's interested in heavy post-production of sound. Radio and similar audio-only recording industries are really attached to live sound, live broadcasts. Even sounds that you would get on a record, music that was played on a record, it's recorded live. It's not treated in post. There's something to be said there about authenticity, the recorded moment. At the same time, again, we've sort of filled these back lots with technicians and artists interested solely in sound, and they're not asked to do anything live other than record, and they then also have an opportunity to re-record. So it's still an exciting time. And we've probably seen maybe some of the early experiments where everyone on the screen has to stand rather close to a vase that's sitting on the table and lean in. I mean, we're laughing, but this is what, microphones are still really large, so we do have this sort of push and pull, right? Sound, we don't see it, but these big honking mics we can see, so there's still this sort of tension. Another important film that we look at here, I don't know if anyone's seen this version of King Kong. Yeah, a couple people. Really fantastic film, still I think holds up. You've probably, if you have any casual relationship to it, have seen some of the stop motion animation, use of miniatures. Of equal importance with the film, heavy post-production with sound. Way that they recorded the orchestra when they were recording and creating the score, moving the mic around to different parts of the orchestra. And also what it did, as I have listed here, they'd hired a legitimate composer in Max Steiner, who comes from that background, and he's a single author, and it becomes a piece of art, right? Larger piece of work. So it's not all bad, right, in terms of visibility and this push and pull that I keep coming back to. Okay, so we'll move on here and we think a little bit about the use of speech, right? Speech is talking. We called them talkies, right? There sure was a lot of that. So we're not, sound effects are in the background if there are any. right? It's about voices front and center for the most part, And we have these types of speech. So we have a theatrical speech, right? Speech is meant to be heard, right? Like doing now, whether it's people talking, it's meant to be heard. We have our textual speech, right? So things that normally would be read, right? If we have people reading aloud, something that they see, just talking, things that otherwise we could have read into the film. I think of even I talked about the Soviet montage films. In so many of their films, they're cuts, right? Within these rapid cuts, they're cuts to like bells being rung. I mean, again, it's not silent, right? We can understand what's supposed to be communicated there. And then we have our emanation. So these are the sort of subtle moments where people are using speech in a way that's maybe not supposed to be directly heard. Maybe something that you wouldn't do in a theatrical setting, but you're able to do in film, and we'll talk a little more about that, whether people are off screen or concepts about dialogue. Imagine folks perhaps have seen Fantasia or are familiar with it a little bit. Organization I'm involved with that does film exhibition happened upon a 16 millimeter print of this film that was in really good shape, and in February, I wasn't present, but we hosted a screening as a thank you to volunteers and students and other folks who've been involved with the organization. I believe it was also passively billed as an anti-Super Bowl event for folks in Brooklyn, New York. So I talked to my friend who put on the screening, and he said, "Oh, how'd it go?" You know, I was really interested in how it went. Showing film, a 16 millimeter, a projector that would sit on the table here and sit with a group of people. And he said, "Wow, I completely forgot how racist this movie is. Oh, we were cringing, the things that were going on." So I have to revisit it. I have not watched it in some time. So things that people are able to do here and get away with. It's a cartoon, so we don't have to worry so much about sync. They're also, again, orchestration, and they have this idea that they want to incorporate multi-channels here, multi-channel sound. So we'll talk in a little bit about sort of mono, stereo, surround. They don't have to sync up with voices moving exactly. So they basically work together. There's sort of a race with many of these corporations to come up with the next big gimmick to get people to come into the theaters. Excuse me. So there were 3 channels behind the screen. So there's a left, center, and a right, as opposed to one. Normally there's one, or if there are multiple speakers, it's still only one channel of sound, right? One source. So the Los Angeles premiere, as I list here, had 96 speakers, maybe a little excessive surrounding the audience. Anybody want to take a guess at how many places across the country presented the film as it was meant to be presented? Not with 96, but just with multi-channel. So 6. So there's this, you know, hopefully you're picking up that like, well, one person does this and then it takes 10 years to catch up. Not exactly, but this is sort of the race. And I'm talking solely about sound tonight, but the same thing is happening with other things like 3D technology, multi-screen technology. So I'm going to think about that. So we talk about those, the sort of maybe lag time that's happening there, But the idea is that you want to attract an audience, but also have something that's stable, right? More than 6 theaters can actually present the movie. So the technical requirements. Recording, easy, pretty stable at this point in time. Microphones are starting to get a little smaller. We'll see a big shift really throughout the 40s. Reproducing, this is where the problem is, an exhibition. Needing to maintain equipment, needing to purchase equipment, not knowing if it's going to change. And we have all of these proprietary formats that are coming out specific to notable brands. So, you know, you have a sales pitch to go along with it. So it's taking a little while to be established. 1950s, the movie-going population decreases by 1/2. Number of reasons there. Of course, we can easily point to television. So again, this is part of the impulse to get people back in the theater. Another thing that's happening is people tend to have a certain affiliation with not only the genre or type of film that they're going to see or the stars, but with some of this technology. And they're finding that the stereo sound that's being used at this time, as we start to move from one track to 2 tracks, 2 or more tracks coming from 2 or more locations, from monaural to stereo. That it's attached to spectacles. We also have a development of widescreen, cinemascope, right? Widescreen cinema. So there's historical epics, sort of spectacles, calling attention calling attention to itself, sound, that is, in the way that it's being used. Whereas mono, sound that people are used to is thought of maybe a little old, but maybe a little also reliable, that it's rooted in realism. So I sort of listed before, and we'll do this a few times when we look at eras. Mono era essentially is the standard. We do have these sort of flourishes of experimentation in multi-channel and stereo and but not quite into surround yet. Dolby stereo, we'll talk a little more about that here in a moment. So it's mid-70s to mid-90s, and then our Dolby surround. And when I refer to Dolby, it's a great name. Even when when the technology hadn't really been exactly how they described it. But it became a notable name. So they were still experimenting, but it's Dolby sound. Yeah, it's Dolby sound. So it was, but it was changing. The technology was changing. The things behind the scenes that you weren't seeing. And so by 1950, there are about 10,000 theaters in the United States that have some version of stereo sound, but as you can see, this is about 25 years before this is really stabilized. I do have some other information here. Few of you are in the Film and American Culture class this semester, and we're reading a textbook called American Cinema, American Culture by John Belton. So here's a comment by him about expectations of what stereo sound meant when you go to see a stereo film in the 50s. Stereo thus continued to be connected not with the average movie-going experience of the 1950s audience, but rather with special presentation, large screen processes, and with blockbuster spectacles. Through its usage as an element of spectacle and through its identification with the genres of spectacle, stereo sound became associated for audiences not so much with greater realism as with greater artifice. Right. I have, thinking a little bit now, we'll talk about some of the technology here. So right, Dolby comes to town, right? So they're using, and we'll take a look here in a moment at what this physically looks like. They're using existing area on the soundtrack, on the film strip itself, and creating technology that they can put more information there, different information that could be read by multiple channels. So what's the nice thing here? They've created something that's retrofit, right? So it will work for theaters that don't have to buy brand new projectors and brand new technology to be able to play the films, maybe add a few speakers and everything, but they're not having to make huge capital investment. So this attracted a lot of folks. Yeah, we've got Dolby, sure thing. Maybe they're able to read 4 channels and you maybe only hear 2, but they've got Dolby, right? So that's something to keep in mind. And so it's termed matrixed. So we've got 4 channels. So we have our left, center, right, and then we have a surround channel. And that could be all around, but usually it would just be a few along the sides. So there have been a few other versions in different formats of Dolby sound here. I would be foolish to not mention some of the films. Since Joe is wearing a Star Wars shirt this evening and also running the camera. Star Wars, of course, ushering in a standardized use, or sometimes hope for a standardized use of multi-track sound, of a multi-track stereo sound. There's a really sort of awful story about a sound designer. Went to see one of the, I guess, which was this, for Return of the Jedi into the 80s with Star Wars. Careful attention to mixing. More and more theaters are getting speakers that can keep up. And goes to see the film with his family, and there's no surround sound, and he politely goes out and asks to speak with somebody, tell them that maybe their speakers were turned off, and was told, no, it's correct. That's how the filmmaker wanted it. There was just sound, and this is somebody who spent years of his life crafting sound specifically for the surround space, multi-track space, right? So we see probably there are some iconic sounds in that film of giant ships moving across the screen, and then as we look into some of the more standardized 5.1 surround sound Star Wars films in the 90s, where they come at you, and it's more of a localized sound. We'll also look at a clip a little later on and talk about development of 5.1 sound. The 0.1 refers to low frequencies. It's a separate, maybe sound that you feel more than you hear, so sound that's not in all of the other speakers there. So there's some additional technology here, and we'll take a look at that. Let me come back here. Oh, sorry. Okay, so we're still talking about sound on a strip of film, right? We've got all this great technology for recording and editing and mixing, but to be synced up, it has to exist in the same space as the film. But there's been some changes in the technology, and I have some better, another close-up here. So we have, right here, we have four types of sound that is printed onto the film strip and read as it's projected, right? So what does that mean? So we have our analog soundtrack, right? Our mono films would have one of these squiggly lines, or something that would look similar to it. Lights passing through it. The film is running through the projector. Light is passing through that area, and a reader, and it picks up the changes the way that that's different across there and turns it into sound. Okay, so that's analog sound, right? The rest of these are digital. So something happens with your digital system, you still have the analog sound. So again, retrofitting for theaters that maybe don't have the digital technology and just have the stereo area that could maybe be used for surround depending on how it's presented. Okay, so we have a DTS time code. These are basically dots and dashes along the side. Those are being read. There's a disc playing in the rack, right? Before we had a record, right, with the stylus crank. Now we have like a CD, right, in the wall presenting our sound. And that is keeping it in sync, right? So that's the digital part of it there, when it's being played back. We have a similar thing happening with the Dolby Digital and the SDDS soundtrack, and I have a really nice sort of close-up here. So here's our DTS, dots and dashes. And here's our typical variable area. Do you see the Dolby in there? You see the D's, right, facing? That's between the sprockets, right? That's minute. Those are being read. Remember, we have 24 frames per second. This is between one frame here. So similar to like a QR code, scan code. Each one's being scanned and being synced to that other device, right? And then we have something similar happening here, although it takes up so much more space. The SDDS, this is Sony's proprietary system, so there's no DD facing each other on this side, but we have a strip here, and then, again, this is just the side of the film. Pictured be, right, if we were to scale here, like to the end here, and then there'd be another area that looks like that with that sort of blue tint to it. So we can see ways that they're still trying to use a strip of film designed and patented in 1889 as a delivery format, as a container, right? And why is this? Why do you think this is? As much as, you know, we've sort of been parsing out some of the changes with audio and the way that it's recorded, formatted, there's something to be said about the stability of 35 millimeter film, right? Frame size has been standardized. Regardless of what camera technology comes out of wherever from around the world, this is the gold standard for theatrical presentation of feature-length films. So it's kind of, I don't know, I've always been sort of fascinated with this image that I can hold up and see a picture, right? One single frame, right, discrete from the other frames. I can touch it, you know, if I put a scratch on it and project it, I see the scratch. But then we have these QR codes, as we think of them, but before there were QR codes, when I would see them, I just thought of like television noise, you know, something like that. So I should also, I'm going to sip on a beverage here for a second. I'm a little dry today, but I also worked in theaters, believe it or not. Worked in the projection booth for a long time. Got to handle a lot of these things, and never told a filmmaker once that that's how the filmmaker wanted it. No, you know, you hear things, you have expectations for how things should be heard. In your own theater as opposed to other theaters, you know your technology, you know how to tweak, make certain adjustments, but things are pretty standard. And this is the truth. I've not once in my life ever worked or hosted or was co-presented or at a screening where a filmmaker in the audience watching his own film ever say, it's too loud? It's never happened. I'm serious. It's not once has it ever happened. I have some theories about that. I've caught myself before. You're nervous. I think there's some physiological things that happen. I can't hear it. You're expecting the sound that's happening next, and you have expectations for what you're used to hearing when you're sitting with earbuds in and editing. It's going to be a little different when you coming out of this speaker in this theater or another space. But never once is it too loud. It's always turn it up. That's always that'll make it better. If I get a little more, it'll sound like what I want it to. It's true. I've told students this, and student employees and others, and said because what happens is, if people don't know, they go up, they crank it, and then the people who know, who've been to the theater or are not invested in it that way, always come out and say, "Oh, it's so loud, turn it down." Well, the filmmaker's here, so I can't turn it down. It's a true story. Just another pretty picture. I couldn't help myself. I like looking at these. It's a very, very similar. Just shows us the other side of the frame here with this one, just a little larger. All right. Just a few minutes here thinking about concepts. What does all this mean, right? So we have a little bit of a history, a little bit of the technology. So where does that bring us now? And hopefully you can think about some of these things before we listen to our examples. I had a quote earlier on from French film scholar Michel Chion. Some really wonderful ideas about sound leading film. One of his more recent texts is film, a sound art, and is going back through history and revisiting films with all of the information and understanding and research we have now about sound, and going back to these films, and there's a really strong reevaluation of a lot of these films. So he has this idea among a number of the really brilliant ideas of phrasing, right? So we think about audiovisual phrasing. So we take the sort of total rhythm. We think about the relationship to our own breath, but combining both picture and sound and our experience of it without diminishing either. So we think about sound and how it constructs space, and it does not have to be wedded to a synchronized talkie. It doesn't have to be an exact replica of reality when we think about ways to start measuring. Part of the challenge here is coincidentally coming up with a common language, way to establish and evaluate sound, which we've not really been able to do in similar terms that we do with an image. We sit and we watch an image and it's soft, it's blurry, it's out of focus. We think this is not on purpose, this is a mistake, or it's being used artistically. We may not have exact, and I could tell you what soft and out of focus and blurry means, and we can pretty much agree on it, and we're just now, without even seeing it, right? If I do the same, use similar descriptors for sound, we probably would have different ideas about ways that we could talk about sound qualitatively in that way. So that's one of the things that I think Chion is up to here that I really appreciate. So one of his sort of critical ideas is termed as acousmetra, right? That there's a power in sound that we can't see where it's coming from. We don't know the source, and there's a power that it has, and it is specific to cinema, specific to film. It's rather compelling when he applies it to a number of films, as I mentioned, he's revisiting. Normally, early sound studies for film in particular talk about diegetic sound and non-diegetic sound. Well, sort of decided that maybe that's not sufficient. So we still have our non-diegetic sound, and so we're watching a film, that's going to be sound that exists, say, outside of the film, the world within the film, but exists in our world. So the musical score, right? Or we don't believe that our characters hear that sound most of the time, right? That's just for us, right? There are other things like that that happen that don't exist, of course, within the world of the film. Sometimes we have narration that exists, right? We have sometimes termed as the voice of God, used in documentary. We don't see who this person is. He's got a really lovely voice. She's telling us this, this, and that. It must be true, and I can see a picture of it. So it can be dangerous as well. But in terms of this power dynamic here, so we have sound that exists within the film that's on the screen, so we see the source, right? We see it, and sound outside of the frame. Not on the screen, we don't see it, but it, of course, still has some power there. All right, so I really like this list here, and this is some relatively some newer terms that Xion is sharing with us here, and he talks about the ears, the 12 ears of cinema, and sometimes they're like this microphone or this microphone, and sometimes they're actually ears. But we're, thinking more theoretically here. So a technical ear would be a microphone, right? Something that's designed to pick up sound, and we understand that that has a relationship to cinematic sound. So we have character ear, right? So that there's sound meant for the characters to hear. So meant to be heard exchange between the characters. We have the ear of the spectators, right? Whenever sound is being presented there, meant some, maybe all of it's meant for the spectators. I have our character's ear in quotation. So something that may be directed for a character that's not there, right? Not in a way that's like exposition. We have the ear of someone sleeping. This is a trope we see in film a lot. Talking to someone who's asleep. But we recognize that this is a precious moment because they have an ear and it's right there and I can see it and maybe they can hear what's being said, and even if they can, it was meant for it. So he really sort of picks apart some of these things. We have the ear of the dead. This happens a lot as well. Something was a lost opportunity to communicate, and on the person who is deceased, the lost opportunity as well. He has this idea of the ear of something about to begin or about to be born, whether it's a relationship. Somebody talks about, the night we met. There's a shared experience that's described there that becomes part of the story, right? Whether or not that was their exact, whether it was the character's experience of it. We have characters being talked about. There's a threat that they may hear or not. Sometimes that's used for comedic relief sometimes. So we have we have the ear of the space or place. If these walls could talk, Um, so we see this in horror films and other really nice examples of don't say that here, right? Don't do that, right? So thinking more about sci-fi, the threat of the unknown that can hear. And then, of course, we think about bugging or miking or sort of general pervasive recording in our lives. So we have the ear of none, right? Great example is you get the phone call and something happens and you get that great shot of the phone left on the table as they run out the door and someone's speaking there, an expectation that there's an ear on the other side, and there's not. So we have the implied ear in the actor's voice. So this is how they hear themselves or how they think that they are being heard. And then, of course, he includes the great ear, and it may be more, he leaves it open, can be described as he says on one hand, the ear of God. It could also be similar to the ear of none, depending on your beliefs. So the ear of all sound. So it's pretty interesting stuff. I think sort of sit and listen to films in that way. I promised some of our Dolby tags here. Currently there are about 40,000 indoor screens for film presentation here in the States. About 5,000 outdoor screens. Folks go to drive-in movies anymore? Couple? Yeah? You're in Moon, right? So there you go. I think that theater just opened. Yeah, like last week. Yeah. I'm sorry? Yeah, nice. One of the things I wanted to also talk about today is that a lot of the technology that's developed, digital cinema, digital presentation, don't have to worry about the wear and tear on the prints. We've had this stabilization of exhibition. So, when I have the old school spectral recording, Dolby Stereo, that's late 50s, early 60s, and then the Dolby Digital, which was formalized into the 90s, and then I have our Dolby Digital Surround EX. But I'm sure if you've been to any commercial theater, there's about 15 more of these. Just recognize that a lot of this technology you can purchase on a budget for the most part, and sound as it was meant to be heard in a theatrical setting can be experienced at home without a significant loss of quality. Working with digital sounds, we have greater dynamic range, greater fidelity, so a full range of hearing is able to be properly represented there. Just a few more notes here, and then we'll listen to some examples. When we think about surround sound technology now, pretty standard if we go to see a film. If we recall to early stereo sound, sort of calling attention to itself with spectacles. So there are a few principles right now, and we can think about those today and onward, that on one hand, very basic level, think about mono sound. We see the source, where the sound is coming from, it's believable. We move into more stereo, maybe that enhances what's believable there, but also can call attention to itself sometimes. So I gave the example of the spacecraft moving across the screen left to right. Does it make it, and this is a question, does it make it more believable, or does it call attention to itself and take you out of the film as opposed to it just being a 2-channel stereo, let's say? And then finally, and I think an important point to take away today is thinking about using sound to locate your relationship to the screen or to the speakers. So that's how surround sound is being used. But in doing so, right, so things sound different over here and then here and then here. There's an optimal space to full surround, right, be immersed. Still, for the most part, we're getting our important elements. If we're in a narrative film, our dialogue, we're not getting dialogue whipping all around us and overhead and underneath through the seats or anything, right? It's going to be front and center. And maybe the complementary or supplemental sound around, or calling attention to itself, something more shocking. But in addition to locating us in the crowd, what it also does is, and I'll argue for this in a few of these examples here, it helps to create a narrative space that didn't exist otherwise. And to achieve that, there are particular cuts to both sound and image. I talked before about our Soviet montage, and they're wanting to cut up the sound just like they cut up the images. A lot of the argument for, or throughout the sound studies in cinema, is that soundtrack needs to be stable, straight ahead. To locate folks with early technology, it needs to be front, center, direct at everybody. Should be the same all around, so you shouldn't have to get there a half hour early and sit through an hour of Coke commercials before the film finally hits the screen to get a good seat in the center. So there's some ideas there about what's being privileged. And so the nice thing here, you can buy all the Coca-Cola you want or not and sit at home and, again, pick up and experience the film the way it was designed, conceived all the way through. So I want to look at a few examples here, and I won't talk over any of the films, and maybe while I'm switching them up we can talk briefly, but I just wanted to show a few clips here. It was intentional, the way that they designed this opening scene. Most of the movie, it's a lot of talking, a lot of people in a boardroom, a lot of talking heads, a lot of faces of college students. And the idea was that we're going to mix and edit in a way to get people to tune in. And I actually saw some folks leaning forward a little bit. So, for example, the sound in the background is pretty loud, right? The music is there, the bar music. They actually had the extras who normally, shooting a scene like this, would not be talking at all, would just be miming. Had them speak at regular volume and carry on full conversations. So they went to great lengths to fill in the sound there, and we can see how there are some pregnant pauses there, the back and forth. So much of the film is close-ups, medium close-ups of faces and reactions back and forth. In this first 5 minutes really clues us in to that.
The music is interesting too.
Yeah, I wanted to go on a little further, but I want to get just a couple more in there. But no, it's fine. No, what do you find interesting about it? Let's listen to it. How about that? What else sticks out to anybody about the sound, the score here? Professor Richards pointed out the minor key of the piano. Yeah, yeah. Well, there's some real underneath, that sort of ghostly sounds, yeah. So does the score was created by Mercer, Pennsylvania native Trent Reznor of Nine Inch Nails fame, and his collaborator Atticus Ross. They did win Academy Award for their work on that film. So there's this tension. This is the guy that doesn't want any friends. That's his sad sack score. We could really parse out that scene rather. Really great shot here. We're almost there.
This is the end, beautiful friend. This is the end, my only friend. The end of our elaborate plans. The end of everything that stands. The end, no safety or surprise. The end, I'll never look into your eyes.
Saigon. Shit. I'm still only in Saigon.
We're almost out of time here, so we'll talk about this briefly and maybe look at one more clip. We'll see how we do here. So we can see some of the different ears at play here, and again, thought it was important to show the beginning of a film that's going to be driven by sound. It's an epic film, almost 3 hours long. It's a history of being sort of trapped in post-production purgatory for quite some time. Complications of shooting in the Philippines, having essentially no usable audio that was recorded in the field based on a number of equipment malfunction and some human error, of course. So a lot of re-recorded, but basically they designed a 5.1 soundtrack, right? So our point one, again, we have speakers in the front, sound, and our point one is our low frequency. So wouldn't be, my voice, although sometimes low, but it would just be the low end of it. So it wouldn't be entire dialogue, and then how that could be presented in the space. Retrofitted, right? Using the existing soundtrack area that's available there. Developed 5.1 sound, and if you recall from the slide earlier, is not established, or formal guidelines aren't established until 1987. The film was released in 1979. So the scene with, of course, the helicopter and the way that sound in a surround sound setting wraps around us. We have the sound from his memory, the sound from outside, the sound of the fan that's approximating. So there's all of this maelstrom, and sets the tone for this psychological drama that's going to take place. Pretty psychedelic scene, and also the soundtrack from The Doors. Really slow. I mean, these transitions are sort of really passive. And let's see. Maybe we'll just do one short clip. Pick another good one here. So again, the sound placing us in world of teenagers and cars. 1973 American Graffiti, directed by George Lucas, working with Walter Murch, and he has this idea. First of all, it's the first feature-length film that has a wall-to-wall contemporary music soundtrack. So throughout the film, we spend a night with these teenagers. We have the radio station in the background, but it's not just piped in, right? The establishing shot that we had there, that could have been our non-diegetic sound, right? Was this something, a score that only we can hear? And then we begin to cut to some of the cars and hear how the sound is different from the inside of this car, from the outside of another car. And again, they're using early sound recording technology. This is mono technology for a presentation, but they're going to great lengths to locate the sound. Re-recording the sound, and this idea that Murch puts forth about worldizing. So recorder is over there, and I'm playing back the sound here, and we're mimicking the movement of a car, the Doppler effect that one would have there. And then placing that into the film. So again, the technology not having to be extremely advanced, but being creative with placement of sound. And it helps to create a world, and again, we have those layers of sound that's on screen, sound that's off screen, and the power therein, and then the sound outside of that. And those lines are blurred throughout the film that sort of puts us into this cloak of night, of cruising around with teens, and then the last bit there, hearing actual audio from a broadcast announcer, Wolfman Jack, that they went through and again played them back in different spaces and picked up with the microphones and moving the speakers to get the sound that one would have in the real world. So moving the sound out into the world. We can do that now with the push of a button for the most part. Any number of sound effects are built into our editing software now. So, okay, so that's my time for tonight.
I would just have to say that it really set the scene. I mean, for me, that's when I was growing up, and it set the scene. I suppose the way the sound and everything,
Mhm.
cars, and for the nostalgic feeling that,
Mhm.
those of us who were there then
Mhm.
felt. It just really did a good job of that.
Yeah, and the thing that always strikes me about the film, it's a favorite for sure, and it's flawed as well. There's some holes in it, but it's set in 1962, and it's only 1973 we're there. So I mean, we're watching it now, and so when you mentioned nostalgia, to think about how much care was put forth to something that wasn't really that, right?
But it was a different,
You know?
it was a different era.
It's the switching, yeah. It's the switching of the yeah. I find it hard to, and maybe it's part of the era and what's going on. Some of that is. I think it'd be hard pressed to find a film released next week that could really place me in 2005. You know, the iPods would be bigger. Phones would flip. We see some of that. But again, it's the texture, I think, is also what you're talking about. And some of the folks have heard this. We screened this in one of the film classes early this semester. But another thing they did, my last point here, visually, the idea, the concept, make the film look like a jukebox. That's the visual palette for the film. So we've got sort of dark, high contrast, things that are lit are rims, right? The way the shine on the colors are happening. So we just get the outline of like what a jukebox would look like across the bar, right? Or across the dance hall or across the arcade. So that was the visual palette that they were after with the film, and they made some other choices about. It's a grainier look to the film, and they thought that they wanted it to be rooted in, at that time, more documentary feel. So they actually used a format. It's a wider screen, but they actually only use half of the space of the film to get a widescreen effect. So there's less resolution, and we have a more sort of grainy, more documentary look to it. So, okay. Well, thanks so much for coming out tonight, and as you can tell, I really like talking about this stuff and listening, and I hope to do more of these and focus in a little more on some of the things we've talked about, use of music in particular, looking at film history through contemporary music, history, rock and roll, history in particular is a strong scholarly interest, and a few others. So. Documentary film. So hopefully have a chance to meet with you all again along those topics. So thanks so much. And we've got a few more.
Thank you, Ron, for your fascinating presentation tonight. Very stimulating and intriguing. We'll look forward to more from you this fall.
Absolutely.
In the meantime, in April, we have two more events here at Pedas Center. There's going to be a presentation by Professor Richards talking about history of communication in April, and also we're going to be having a guest speaker from Duquesne University here in April, also talking about the sports media business, and that should also be very stimulating. So please watch the campus website, local newspaper, and other places where we're announcing community events, and hope to see you here then. Thanks a lot, and good night.
Thanks.